I was sitting in my office, habitually flipping through my notes before the first appointment. The day promised to be ordinary: routine consultations, filling out reports, and everything that had long since become my comfort zone. But, as often happens, an ordinary morning had a surprise in store. A new client walked into the office. A young man, about 26 years old, tall, with a confident posture. His gaze was calm yet piercing, as though he was looking right through you, studying deeper than words could reach. He sat down in the chair across from me, as if that seat belonged to him. "How can I help you?" I asked, slightly surprised by his confident demeanor. He remained silent for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. "I want to understand why people react to me the way they do," he finally said. His voice was steady but carried a faint undertone of mystery. The statement caught me off guard. Usually, clients came with worries, anxieties, specific problems, but his words felt different, as if it wasn't a request for help, but a question to which he already half knew the answer. "And how do you think they react?" I asked cautiously. "It's hard to explain," he said with a slight smirk. "People either fear me or try to please me, but they never see me for who I truly am. I want to understand why." His words made me feel unsettled. There was something about him that threw me out of my usual rhythm. I felt a subtle tension, as if this wasn't just any client but someone who had come to upend something in my life. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, reflecting on the conversation. There was something about this man that felt unlike anything I had encountered before. The next day, Jason came back. I had expected the session to begin the same way as yesterday, but it quickly became clear that the usual methods didn't work with him. He sat in the chair across from me with the same calmness, and it made me tense. His confidence was peculiar, not arrogant, but certainly not typical of someone seeking help. Normally, I start with formal questions, but you don't seem like someone who needs therapy. What brought you here? I broke the usual script. He gave a faint smile, tilting his head as if he had been waiting for me to ask that very question. "I already told you. I want to understand how people see me and why they react the way they do," he said. But this time, his voice carried a note of something personal, as if he was withholding something significant. "And how do you see yourself?" I asked, trying to regain control of the conversation. Jason hesitated before answering. His gaze drifted across the room, not settling on anything in particular. "Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a role," he said, "as if I exist not for myself, but for them." Those words struck a chord within me. Perhaps it was because I had been feeling the same way lately, like a cog in someone else's machine. His admission made me reflect, but I couldn't allow myself to get lost in my own feelings. "Do you want to step out of that role?" I asked. He looked at me, and I felt something inside me shift. His gaze was intense, almost uncomfortably intimate. "What if that role is all I am?" he said quietly, but his words sounded like a challenge. Our eyes met, and in the silence that followed, I felt the familiar boundaries between therapist and client beginning to blur. This conversation wasn't just a professional session. It felt like he was testing me, peering into places I didn't want anyone to see. After he left, I was alone in my office again, but this time my thoughts weren't on the routine. Jason had brought something with him, something I couldn't quite explain. And the worst part was, I wanted to know more. After a tense day, I returned home to the suburbs. Our small house, surrounded by snow-covered trees, had once felt cozy. Now it looked more like a cage. Familiar things, the wooden chairs, the faded sofa, the book left on the coffee table, no longer brought me any warmth. They had become part of the routine in which I'd long been stuck. On the terrace sat my husband, Robert, with a tablet in his hands. The wind stirred his hair, but he didn't seem to notice, absorbed in the endless stream of news. "Hi," I said, pausing in the doorway. He glanced up for a split second and nodded, not even offering a smile. Then his eyes dropped back to the screen, as if I were merely part of the background. I walked inside, feeling a dull ache in my chest. Once we used to talk about everything: his work, my plans, where we'd go for the weekend. Now only habitual silence bound us together. In the kitchen, I made tea, hoping the scent of fresh mint would soften the chill of this silence. With the cup in hand, I returned to the terrace, where Robert was still sitting, his attention fixed on the tablet. "How was your day?" I asked, trying not to sound too demanding. "Fine," he replied curtly, without even looking at me. Those words hit me like a blow. I wanted to continue the conversation but realized he wasn't listening. At some point I stopped speaking because I understood. I no longer wanted to fight for his attention. We lived side by side but in parallel worlds, with intersections that had grown rare. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling. Thoughts of Jason resurfaced. His words, his gaze, his strange ability to see me as I was, something no one else seemed to do anymore, kept troubling me. It wasn't just about him. It was about how he had reminded me of the desires and dreams I had buried beneath layers of monotony. That night, I slept fitfully, haunted by the feeling that my familiar, reliable boundaries were beginning to crack. The next day, Jason appeared again, but this time, he was late. He called just as my workday was ending, apologizing for his tardiness. His tone was calm, but there was something about the way he spoke that made me agree to reschedule without hesitation. I barely realized when I suggested meeting outside the office. "There's a cafe nearby. It's quiet, not too many people," I said, almost automatically. "All right, let's meet there," he replied. When I arrived at the cafe, Jason was already waiting. He sat by the window, tucked away in a corner where the dim light from a nearby lamp created a sense of seclusion. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the table. That strange tension returned, washing over me like a wave. "I didn't think therapists met clients outside their offices," he said with a slight smirk as I sat down across from him. "I didn't think so either," I replied honestly. He studied me as though he were seeing me for the first time. His gaze wasn't intrusive, but it carried the same piercing insight as before. At that moment, maintaining professional distance felt nearly impossible. "Do you always control the situation like this?" I suddenly asked, attempting to reclaim the upper hand. He smiled faintly. "Not always. With you I lose something too," he admitted, his words carrying more weight than just a simple reply. Our conversation gradually shifted into something more personal. He asked questions, not about my professional expertise as most clients would, but about my life. What do I love? Why did I choose therapy? I answered, even as I felt my usual boundaries slipping away. It was as if he was drawing something out of me that I hadn't realized was there. "Are you comfortable with the way you're living?" he asked suddenly, and I froze. I didn't know how to respond. The question hit like a blow because I hadn't allowed myself to think about it in a long time. Instead of answering, I looked away, but Jason didn't press. His silence spoke louder than words. As the evening wound down, he offered to walk me home. Outside, the streets were quiet, with only the sound of our footsteps breaking the stillness. The conversation continued, but it felt lighter now, as if the tension had dissolved into the cool night air. When we reached my house, I lingered at the door for a moment. Through the window, I could see Robert sitting in front of the television, not even turning to acknowledge my return. Jason noticed this, and it seemed like he understood more than I intended to reveal. "Thank you for tonight," he said softly, his voice almost intimate. I nodded, unable to find the right words. There was something in his gaze I couldn't quite define. Was it a promise or a warning? When Jason touched my wrist, I didn't have time to fully process what was happening. His hand was warm, his touch gentle, yet assured. We were standing in the kitchen, where the dim lighting created a coziness I hadn't felt in a long time. The house that had once seemed like a cage now felt like the backdrop for something new and unfamiliar. "I should probably go," he said, but he didn't move. The piercing look in his dark eyes seemed to search for an answer in my reaction, an answer he couldn't put into words. I felt the tension between us grow, filling the space entirely. I knew I should say something, find a way to stop this, but instead, I stood there, feeling something long forgotten stir within me. When he leaned closer, it all happened so naturally that I couldn't tell who made the first move. His kiss was soft, yet it carried the same confidence he had exuded from the start. I closed my eyes, allowing myself just for a moment to forget the rules, the obligations, the familiar life. It was a brief moment, but it changed everything. I was the first to pull away, not out of guilt but out of fear of what might come next.